Welcome to Mini Stories, where we will be listening to the story Behind the School Gates. Chapter 1, A New Beginning. I remember the first day of high school like it was yesterday. The excitement in the air was palpable, as if every student had arrived with a fresh start, ready to take on the world. For most of them, it was just another year in the long path toward graduation. But for me, it was different. I was a transfer student. New to everything and everyone. No one knew me, and I didn't know anyone. I was the new kid in a sea of faces that had all been molded by years of familiarity and comfort. I walked through the doors of Riverwood High with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The school was large, its brick walls towering above me like a fortress of opportunity and anxiety. I could hear the buzz of conversations all around me, groups of friends reuniting after the summer, the laughter echoing from the hallways. But in the middle of all this noise, I felt alone. I had never been the most outgoing person, and making friends had always been a challenge for me. Back at my old school, I had kept to myself, preferring the company of books and daydreams over the cliques and drama that came with the teenage social world. I had always been content in my own little bubble, but as I walked into that new school, I realized that bubble would have to burst. My first class was English, and I took a deep breath as I entered the room. It was a large lecture hall, students already settled into their seats, scribbling in notebooks or chatting quietly. I scanned the room for an empty seat, my heart racing. I spotted a spot near the back, next to a girl with long brown hair and glasses. She was reading a novel, oblivious to the world around her. I sat down slowly, trying not to draw attention to myself. I tried to focus on the book I had brought with me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being judged. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, wondering if people were looking at me and thinking, "Here comes the new kid," or if I was completely invisible to them. The bell rang, signaling the start of class, and the teacher, Mr. Holden, began introducing himself. He had a friendly, approachable demeanor, but I could hardly focus on what he was saying. Instead, I found myself glancing at the girl beside me. She looked peaceful, absorbed in her book, and I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of envy. How could someone be so comfortable in a place like this? As the class went on, I couldn't shake the sense of isolation that clung to me. When the bell rang, I gathered my things quickly and made my way to the next class. I had no idea where I was going, so I followed the flow of students, hoping to blend in unnoticed. The halls were even busier between classes. Groups of friends walked by, laughing and chatting like they had known each other forever. I felt out of place, a stranger in a sea of familiarity. But then, something happened. As I turned a corner, I bumped into someone. "Hey, watch where you're going," a voice snapped. I looked up, startled. Standing before me was a tall guy with messy blonde hair and a mischievous grin. His blue eyes were bright, and his expression was one of mock annoyance, but I could see the humor behind it. "Sorry," I muttered, my face flushing with embarrassment. He raised an eyebrow. "You're the new kid, right?" I nodded, feeling the weight of his scrutiny. "Well, welcome to Riverwood," he said, his voice friendly. "I'm Jake. If you need help finding your way around, just ask." He gave me a grin before walking off, disappearing into the crowd of students. I stood there for a moment, surprised by his kindness. It wasn't much, just a simple offer, but it was the first time anyone had acknowledged me since I arrived. I felt a small spark of hope, something I hadn't felt since stepping into this school. As the day went on, I realized that maybe high school wouldn't be so bad after all. Sure, I still felt like an outsider, but I had made it through the day. I looked up, startled. And maybe, just maybe, I could find my place here. Chapter 2, The Struggle to Fit In. The days that followed were a blur of new classes, new faces, and more awkward moments than I cared to count. As I navigated through the maze of Riverwood High, I began to notice the unspoken hierarchies that seemed to define the social structure. There were the popular kids, the athletes, the theater kids, and then there were people like me, the ones who slipped under the radar, just trying to get by. Jake had introduced me to a few people, but I still felt like an outsider. It wasn't that anyone was rude, it was just that they all had their groups, their routines. It was hard to break into something that felt so established, like trying to squeeze into a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. I started sitting alone during lunch, trying to get a handle on everything. I spent my time in the library, hiding behind books, pretending I was content to be alone. In a way, it was easier that way. The more I tried to engage, the more awkward I felt. But as the days passed, I found myself looking for something, a sign that maybe I wasn't invisible after all. It was during one of these lonely lunches that I noticed her, the girl from my English class. She was sitting alone too, her nose buried in her book, completely unaware of the world around her. I was struck by how different she was from the other students. While they all seemed to care so much about appearances and social status, she was perfectly content in her own little world. I decided to take a chance. After all, how much worse could it be? I walked over to her table, hesitating for a moment before I cleared my throat. "Hey, mind if I sit here?" I asked, my voice more nervous than I intended. She looked up, her eyes widening in surprise. For a moment, I thought she might turn me down, but then she smiled softly and nodded. "Sure," she said, closing her book and setting it aside. "I'm Emily." "I'm Lily," I replied, sitting down across from her. From that moment on, Emily and I began to talk more. We found that we had more in common than I expected. Both of us loved reading, both of us had a complicated relationship with our parents, and both of us felt like we didn't quite belong. I found comfort in her presence, a quiet reassurance that maybe I wasn't so alone in this world after all. But there was one thing I didn't expect: Emily had connections. She knew people. And soon, I found myself pulled into her circle, meeting others who were a little less judgmental, a little more accepting. As I grew closer to Emily, I began to feel like maybe high school wasn't such a battle after all. But, even with the new friends, the weight of feeling like an outsider never truly lifted. I knew I had a long way to go before I truly understood how to navigate this world of expectations, cliques, and unwritten rules. Still, for the first time since walking through those school doors, I began to feel like maybe I could belong. Chapter 3: Unraveling Connections. The more I spent time with Emily, the more I realized how different our lives were. She was effortlessly cool, confident, independent, and always the center of attention wherever she went. It was like she had this magnetic pull that drew people to her, and I found myself in awe of her ability to navigate high school so smoothly. It was as though she had mastered the social game without even trying. Meanwhile, I was still struggling to keep my head above water. Sure, I had Emily as a friend now, but that didn't automatically make me one of the popular kids. It didn't matter that I was starting to feel more comfortable with her group. I was still the shy girl who was trying to figure out how to get a seat at the lunch table. I didn't fit into the mold that everyone else seemed to have so easily. One afternoon, Emily invited me to hang out at her house after school. It was a Friday, and I had no real plans, so I agreed without hesitation. When I arrived, I was taken aback by the size of her house. It was big, luxurious even, with white columns and a sprawling garden. It felt like something out of a movie. Inside, the house was just as grand. Everything looked pristine, from the marble floors to the chandeliers hanging from the ceilings. Her family had money, and it was evident in every detail of their home. I tried not to let it make me feel out of place, but it was hard to ignore the contrast between this world and mine. My house was small, cozy, but nothing like this. Still, Emily seemed completely at ease, tossing her backpack onto a couch and grabbing snacks from the kitchen like she owned the place. She was so different from me in so many ways. But there was one thing I noticed: despite her outward confidence, there was a certain loneliness in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. It was subtle, but it was there, especially when she wasn't looking at me. We spent the afternoon talking, watching movies, and snacking on popcorn, and for the first time, I felt like I wasn't just the awkward new girl. I was part of something that was a little more real than just surface-level small talk in the hallways. Later that evening, as I was getting ready to leave, Emily's mom came into the living room, holding a glass of wine. She gave me a smile that seemed a little too forced, and I could sense the coolness in her tone when she addressed me. "So, you're Lily," she said. "How's school been treating you?" I nodded awkwardly. "It's been okay. Just figuring it all out." Her mother smiled tightly. I'm sure you'll figure it out. High school can be a lot. I wasn't sure what she meant by that, but I didn't say anything. I couldn't help but notice how Emily's mom spoke to me as if I was an outsider. Emily's world, her family's world, felt so far removed from mine, and I didn't know how to navigate that space. Emily didn't seem to notice the tension, though, as she hugged me. Goodbye. See you on Monday, okay, she said brightly. We'll do this again sometime. I nodded, smiling, but as I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the way Emily's family treated me felt different. I didn't belong here, and they seemed to know it. Chapter 4, Secrets Unveiled. Monday rolled around, and the weight of the weekend still lingered in my chest. I had spent most of the night thinking about Emily's family, the way her mom had looked at me. It was subtle, but I could tell that she saw me as an outsider. The whole experience made me question if I would ever truly be able to fit into Emily's world. I didn't want to make things awkward between us, but I couldn't help but feel like there was a gap between us, one that I wasn't sure I could cross. When I walked into school that morning, I was greeted by the usual buzz of students, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. It wasn't just my unease about Emily's world, it was something else, something I couldn't put my finger on. As I walked down the hallway, I bumped into Jake again. He was leaning against a locker, texting someone, when he looked up and noticed me. A small smile spread across his face, and my heart skipped a beat. I hadn't realized until now how much I looked forward to seeing him. Hey, he said, pushing off the locker. How's your day going so far? I shrugged. It's okay. Just busy. You? Jake glanced around before looking back at me. Same old, same old. You know how it is. There was a pause, and then he grinned. Want to skip class and go grab some coffee? I know a place nearby. I hesitated for a moment. Skipping class wasn't something I typically did, but the idea of spending time with Jake, of getting away from the chaos of school, the cliques, and the pressure, was tempting. Maybe it would be nice to take a break from everything. Before I could answer, Emily appeared behind me, her eyes bright. She was holding a coffee cup in one hand, looking relaxed and confident. Lily, she called. Hey, I was looking for you. Jake shot me a quick look, then turned to Emily. I was just inviting her to coffee. Emily raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a teasing smile. Oh? You two getting along now? I felt a blush creep up my neck. We're just talking, I muttered. Emily laughed lightly, clearly not bothered by the situation. Well, since you two seem to be hitting it off, why don't you join me instead? I could use some company. She gave Jake a knowing look, then turned back to me. What do you say? I glanced between the two of them, unsure of what to do. The tension in the air was thick, and I realized there was something deeper here, something I didn't quite understand yet. Jake and Emily had known each other for years, and there was a history between them. Maybe it was just my imagination, but it felt like I was stepping into a web of unspoken dynamics. Before I could respond, Jake smiled. Actually, I think I'll pass today. Maybe some other time. Emily's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered, turning to me. No problem. We'll catch up later, right? I nodded. Yeah, of course. As I watched Jake walk away, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off between him and Emily. It was subtle, but it was there, something unspoken, something I wasn't meant to understand yet. That afternoon, Emily and I sat together during lunch, but my mind kept drifting back to Jake. I couldn't help but wonder what was going on beneath the surface. And as much as I tried to shake it off, I knew that things weren't as simple as they seemed. There was more to this high school world, and I was only beginning to scratch the surface. Chapter 5, The Confession. The week had passed in a blur of mixed emotions. Every day felt like a new challenge, navigating the expectations of school, trying to keep up with friends, and dealing with the constant undercurrent of tension between me, Emily, and Jake. Something had shifted since that coffee invitation. It wasn't just that Emily had invited me into her world, it was more than that. There was a complexity to our interactions that I wasn't sure how to handle. I found myself thinking more about Jake, about his easy grin, the way his eyes seemed to understand me even when I hadn't spoken a word. It was hard to ignore the fact that I was beginning to feel something for him, something more than just friendship. And yet, there was Emily, my friend, who had always been so open with me, always so kind. I didn't want to betray her trust, but I also couldn't help the flutter of my heart whenever Jake was near. It was a Friday afternoon when things finally came to a head. I was sitting by myself in the library, flipping through a history textbook. My mind wasn't on the material, though. It kept drifting back to the conversation I had overheard earlier in the day. Emily and Jake were talking, but it wasn't a typical conversation. There had been tension in Jake's voice, and Emily had sounded upset. It wasn't until I had walked closer to the hallway that I heard Emily say something that stopped me dead in my tracks. "I don't know why you're acting this way, Jake. You know I don't want things to be complicated between us. We've been through this before." I hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the words hit me like a punch in the gut. They had a history. They had been through something together, something that I didn't understand. Now, I sat alone, trying to shake off the confusion. Why hadn't Emily told me? Why was Jake acting so distant? It felt like I was caught in the middle of something I wasn't prepared for. My thoughts were interrupted when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I looked up, startled, to find Jake standing there, looking at me with an unreadable expression. "Hey," he said softly, sitting down across from me. "Can we talk?" I blinked, taken aback by the suddenness of his presence. Sure. What's up?" He hesitated for a moment, running a hand through his hair. His usual confident demeanor seemed to be gone, replaced by something softer. "I need to tell you something. About Emily and me." My heart raced. I already knew this wasn't going to be easy. "Okay," I said, keeping my voice steady, though I could feel my pulse quickening. "We were close once," he began, his voice low, "before all of this. Before high school. But things changed. We've tried to keep a friendship, but it hasn't been the same. She's a part of my past. I think we both know that." His words hung in the air, and I swallowed, unsure of where this conversation was headed. "So, what does that mean for us?" "For me?" I asked carefully, though a part of me already knew what he was going to say. Jake's eyes met mine, and for a moment, there was an intensity there that made my stomach flutter. "It means that I like you, Lily," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to complicate things, but I can't ignore what I feel anymore. I've been trying to pretend it wasn't there, but it's been hard. I felt like the world had stopped spinning for a moment. The realization hit me like a wave, washing over me in a rush. Jake, the guy I had been drawn to since the first time we met, felt the same way. I blinked, trying to process his words. "Jake, I don't know what to say." "Emily, I know," he interrupted, his voice tinged with regret. "I don't want to hurt her, but I can't keep pretending that I don't feel this way about you." I sat there, trying to wrap my head around everything. "But I don't want to come between you two. You've known each other for so long." Jake leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "I'm not asking you to choose, Lily. I'm just asking for a chance." I stared at him for a long moment, unsure of what to say. A part of me was still holding on to the friendship I had with Emily, not wanting to disrupt things. But another part of me, the part that had been silently wishing for something more with Jake, felt a spark of hope. Before I could speak, Jake gave me a small smile, as if he understood the hesitation. "Take your time. I just needed to be honest with you." Chapter 6, The Choice. The weekend passed in a blur. I spent most of it trying to clear my head, replaying the conversation with Jake over and over in my mind. It was hard to ignore the pull I felt toward him, but the weight of my friendship with Emily was heavy on my shoulders. I couldn't help but feel guilty for even considering it. Emily had been nothing but kind to me, and now, I was in a position where I had to choose between her and Jake. On Monday, I walked into school with a tight chest, the pressure of the decision weighing heavily on me. I wasn't sure how to face Emily, how to act around Jake. But I knew one thing for sure, I couldn't keep ignoring my feelings. I had to be honest with myself, and that meant facing the truth, no matter how difficult it would be. During lunch, I sat at the usual table with Emily, trying to act normal. But she could tell something was off. She looked at me carefully, her brow furrowing in concern. "Lily, what's going on?" she asked, her voice gentle but insistent. "You've been distant lately." I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. I didn't know how to explain it, how to tell her that everything had shifted. That I had feelings for Jake, and that I was torn between the two of them. "Emily," I finally said, my voice shaking, "I need to tell you something." She looked at me with confusion, waiting for me to continue. Jake told me that he likes me. And I like him too." Her face fell. For a moment, she didn't say anything, and the silence between us stretched on, unbearable. "I didn't want to hurt you," I said quickly, my words tumbling out. "But I can't pretend that I don't feel this way. I didn't want things to be complicated, but they are. I'm so sorry." Emily took a deep breath, and for a moment, I feared that our friendship was over. But then, to my surprise, she smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "You don't have to apologize," she said softly. "I can see it, Lily. I've always known that you two had something." I blinked, shocked by her response. "You're okay with it?" Emily nodded. "It's not about me. It's about you two. If you like each other, then I'm happy for you. I just want you to be honest with me, okay?" Relief flooded through me as I realized that Emily wasn't angry. She wasn't upset that I had chosen Jake over her. She just wanted me to be happy, and I was so grateful for that. As the day ended, Jake found me again, his eyes searching mine for any sign of my decision. And when I nodded, a quiet smile spread across his face. Without another word, he took my hand, leading me down the hallway with a sense of certainty. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was making the right choice. The uncertainty that had been clouding my thoughts was gone, replaced by a sense of peace. I wasn't just the new girl anymore, I was part of something. And as I looked up at Jake, I knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in my life. The end. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, like, comment, share and subscribe.